Hi everyone, this is Ray, the Singing Tallit, continuing the reading of Alfred Edersheim's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. This is the unabridged version, so it's dense. This is about a 1,000-page book, and we're at chapter 5 now. Alfred Edersheim was the preeminent scholar on Jewish life and how it interfaces with Christianity in the late 1800s. So this book was actually written at right around the 1880s. So a lot of the information that you may at first think, well, this is going to be, old-timey stuff that's just not important. But you're going to see, much like Solomon told us in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. And a lot of the stuff that's being talked about in this book bears a lot of interest for people who are concerned with learning more about the Torah, trying to be able to minister to people who are of the modern Jewish faith. Remember, modern Judaism is essentially the inheritance of Pharisaism. The Pharisees called themselves the set-apart ones. They lived lives that were as clean as they could be. They considered themselves the royal priesthood. We just read in the last Torah portion in Exodus, when we received the Ten Commandments, just before then, Yehovah tells the people from Sinai he wants them to be a kingdom of priests, that is to say a royal priesthood, or meleks, which is kings, and zaddiks, which is priests. So there's the order of Melchizedek, that's Melech and Zaddik. And so you see that if you're trying to talk to people in the modern Jewish faith, it's good to know a lot about the history. Even when Yeshua was talking to his own disciples, he says, look, you're going to have righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. That means not only do you need to understand the actual written Torah, to its fullness, the prophets to the fullness, you're going to have to understand the oral Torah. And that's what's written in the Mishnah. At that point, they hadn't written down the Talmud and such, and the different rabbis and their different opinions about what things mean. But in around the 300s, the Mishnah, which is the oral Torah, was written down. And that was something that was being passed around mouth to ear during the time of Yeshua. And that's in Second Temple times. All right, so let's go into chapter 5. Again, this is Alfred Edersheim's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. Chapter 5. Alexandria and Rome, the Jewish communities in the capitals of the Western civilization. We have spoken of Alexandria as the capital of the Jewish world in the West. Antioch was indeed nearer to Palestine and its Jewish population, including the floating part of it, as numerous as that of Alexandria. But the wealth, the thought, and the influence of Western Judaism centered in the modern capital of the land of the pharaohs. In those days, Greece was the land of the past, to which the student might resort as the home of beauty and art, the time-hallowed temple of thought and poetry. But it was also the land of desolateness and of ruins, where fields of corn waved over the remains of classic antiquity. The ancient Greeks had in great measure sunk to a nation of traders, in keen competition with the Jews. Indeed, Roman sway had leveled the ancient world and buried its nationalistic characteristics. It was otherwise in the Far East. It was otherwise also in Egypt. Egypt was not a land to be largely inhabited, or to be, quote, civilized, unquote, in then the sense of the term. Soil, climate, history, nature forbade it. Still, as now, and even more than now, was it the dreamland of untold attractions to the travelers. The ancient mysterious Nile still rolled its healing waters out into the blue sea, where, so it was supposed, they changed its taste within a radius farther than the eye could reach, to be gently borne in the bark or ships on its waters, to watch the strange vegetation and fauna of its banks, to gaze beyond where they merged into the trackless desert, to wander under the shade of its gigantic monuments, or within the weird avenues of its colossal temples, to see the scroll of mysterious hieroglyphics, to note the sameness of manner and of people as of old, and to watch the unique rites of its ancient religion, that was indeed to be again in the far old and away world, and in that amidst a dreaminess bewitching the senses, and a gorgeousness dazzling the imagination. So what he's saying here is that even in the time of the Second Temple, Egypt was considered a place of mystery and magic. The large community in Alexandria. Alexandria is actually on the border of the Mediterranean Sea, so it's a port city on the western side of Egypt. The central part of Egypt, where the Nile is near where the Great Pyramids are. So you can imagine that those gigantic monuments were probably, fascinating people back then. I mean, they probably, I don't know if necessarily they sold books, or they probably sold, scrolls, or maybe even little leaflet books, stuff with pictures of the pyramids in it, and maybe even maps of the inside of them. So same kind of stuff that interests people nowadays. Again, there's nothing new under the sun. But one of the differences back then was a lot of the old Egyptian practices and cults were still functioning. Nowadays, if you know anything about the Masonry, it actually has a lot of practices that are connected back to the Egyptian temple practices and such. And even Moses himself was a priest in Egypt. And I say that because it says in the scripture that he knew the mysteries of the Egyptians. Now, the only way you get to know the mysteries of a religion is, or a people, is by becoming a part of its religion. That's where you get to learn the mysteries of a culture. Excuse me. So the pyramids and the mystery of Egypt itself was drawing people even then. And Greece was just across the Mediterranean Sea, and it in itself was, covered with the ruins of the different ancient temples. And there were still some, temples that were there, but because Rome had pretty much conquered the ancient world at the time of the Second Temple, everybody was kind of knocked down from the pedestals they used to be on. Egypt at that time was fresh from being conquered by Rome. If you recall the story of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, after Julius Caesar was murdered on the Senate floor, Mark Antony fled to Egypt, which was ruled by Cleopatra, to get together an Egyptian army to come back and take over Rome. And he probably also had Julius Caesar's actual blood son, Caesarion, with him, and that their intent was to come and rule. He had a bloodline heir to the imperial throne of Julius Caesar, right? But Octavius Caesar, who was later renamed Augustus, defeated Mark Antony, defeated Egypt, and took Cleopatra captive. And then, of course, she killed herself before he could take her back to Rome and humiliate her in all the different ways he probably would have. And you got to remember, this girl is not an Egyptian; she's a Greek. Cleopatra is a descendant of Ptolemy, and Ptolemy was one of the 4 generals under Alexander the Great who conquered the ancient world and conquered into to Israel. In fact, the Ptolemy family was the first to own Israel, and after that they were driven out by the Seleucids, and the Seleucids, who Antiochus Epiphanes is a part of, and he was the one that the book of the Maccabees is all about, if you ever get a chance to read that, or if you know anything about the tradition of Hanukkah, that relates to Antiochus's reign and how it affected the people in Israel. So he's painting a picture for us here of the amazing and mysterious place. This isn't just, it's not just, hey, we're the Jews, hey, we got our books and we got our own religion and we don't listen and we're not interested in anything you have. That's not at all what was happening. There were people of different opinions, different mindsets. The Sadducees were known for being very Hellenized. The Pharisees were known for being very anti-Hellenistic, but a lot of the rabbis, because they were very intelligent people, were very interested in a lot of the philosophy that was coming out of ancient Greece. Plato, Pythagoras, Aristotle, a lot of these great thinkers, and they were even trying to rationalize, and we read this in the earlier chapters, trying to rationalize how these men of learning had emerged from Greece. And of course, they said, well, they must have somehow learned from Moses at some point. Somehow they got some teachings that must have come down from Moses. So we'll continue here. We are still far out at sea, making for the port of Alexandria, the only safe shelter all along the coast of Africa and Asia. Quite 30 miles out, the silver sheen of the lighthouse of the Isle of the Pharaohs, connected by a mole with Alexandria, is burning like a star on the edge of the horizon. Now we catch the sight of the palm groves of the Pharaohs. Presently the anchor rattles and grates on the sand, and we are ashore. What a crown of vessels of all sizes, shapes, and nationalities. What a multitude of busy people. What a very babble of languages. What a commingling of old and new world civilizations. And what a variety of wares piled up and unloading and loading. So he's saying that this port, the port of Alexandria, was a very popular port. And again, this is one of the largest Jewish communities that lived in the time of Christ, was living there in Egypt. This is probably where the family of Yeshua fled to when they fled into Egypt. They probably went to Alexandria because that's where most of the other Jews were at. Alexandria itself was not an Egyptian state, was not an old Egyptian, but a comparatively modern city in Egypt, and yet not of Egypt. Everything was in character. The city, its inhabitants, its public life, its art, literature, study, amusements. It was the very aspect of this place. Nothing original anywhere, but a combination of all that had been in the ancient world, or that it was at the time the most fitting place therein to be the capital of Jewish Hellenism. So he's saying that Alexandria was a very worldly city from the whole culture that was around the Mediterranean Sea was trading in Alexandria. It wasn't a purely Jewish city, and it definitely wasn't an ancient Egyptian city, even though it was in the land of Egypt. And it had that flavor, some of the flavor of being in Egypt, so to speak. But it also had the flavor of Greece and of Rome and of probably the Spain or the Gauls and the Celts. They were all those people were there, trading along the Mediterranean. And the western half of Africa, North and Western Africa was trading through the Mediterranean too. Remember, the Mediterranean Sea is a very large inland, they call it the inland sea. It runs all the way from the edge of Spain all the way over to Israel. So that when you hit the Rock of Gibraltar, you're at the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, and that's at the very southwestern tip of Spain, right where it almost touches Africa. There's a little gap between them, and that's the Gap of Gibraltar. That's where the rocks of Gibraltar are. And that is the gateway that goes out into the Atlantic Ocean. But the Mediterranean Sea is a gigantic inland sea that connects all this land, and it's a huge, huge portion of trade that, according to the ancient world, was all going through that sea. All right. As its name indicates, the city was founded by Alexander the Great. It was built in the form of an open fan, or rather of an outspread cloak of a Macedonian horseman. Altogether, it measured 16,360 paces, 3,160 paces more than Rome. But its houses were neither so crowded nor so many storied. It had been a large city when Rome was still inconsiderable, and to be the last held the second place in the empire. One of the 5 quarters into which the city was divided, and which were named according to the first letters of the alphabet, was wholly covered by the royal palaces, with their gardens and their similar buildings, including a royal mausoleum, where the body of Alexander the Great was preserved in honey, and was kept in a glass coffin. But these, and its 3 miles of colonnades along the principal highway, were only one of the magnificent architectural adornations of the city full of palaces. The population amounted probably to nearly 1 million, drawn from the east and western trade routes by the attractions of wealth, the facilities for study, and of the amusements of the singular, frivolous city. A strange mixture of elements among the people, combining the quickness and the versatility of the Greek with the gravity, the conservatism, and the dream grandeur of the luxury of the Eastern world. So what he's saying basically is that this place was world renowned for being a house of learning. If you wanted to know what was going on in the ancient Mediterranean, you could go to Alexandria and find out. If you wanted to get something that came from anywhere around the Mediterranean, you could probably find it in Alexandria. There was 1 million people there. This is the city that Alexander the Great had built. It bears his name. His body is literally bathed in honey and inside a glass coffin there, and you can come and admire it if that's something you like to do. But he's painting this story to help you understand why it had so much influence on the way that the Jews even viewed their own religion. In the last chapter, we talked about Philo and how the influence of the Stoics and of Platonic philosophy had even laid the foundation for such concepts in I say modern, but the Halakha, which is really probably fashioned in the 17th century, so 1600s, 1700s, the idea of the Ein Sof, or God, is this, this ineffable entity that kind of projects part of himself into reality, and by his manifestations you can know him. These are actually all ancient Greek concepts and attempts to understand who the unknowable God is at the time. All right, let's see. Ooh. 3 worlds met in Alexandria: Europe, Asia, and Africa, and it brought to it, or fetched from it, their treasures. Above all, it was a commercial city, furnished with an excellent harbor, or rather with 5 harbors, A special fleet carried as tribute from Alexandria to Italy 2/10 of the corn produced in Egypt, which sufficed to feed the capital for 4 months of the year. A magnificent fleet it was, from the light, quick sailer to those immense corn ships which hoisted a special flag, and whose early arrival was awaited at Puteoli with more eagerness than that of a modern ocean steamer. The commerce of India was in the hands of the Alexandrian shippers. Since the days of the Ptolemies, the Indian trade alone had increased sixfold. Nor was there any native industry inconsiderable, linen goods, to suit the tastes or customs of all countries, woolen stuffs of every hue, some curiously wrought with figures or even scenes, glass of every shade and every shape, paper from the thinnest sheets to the coarsest packing paper, essences, perfumes. Such were the native products. However idly or luxuriously inclined, still everyone seemed busy in a city where, as Emperor Hadrian had expressed it, quote, money was the people's god, unquote, and everyone seemed well-to-do in his own way. From the waif in the streets, who with little trouble to himself could pick up sufficient to go to a restaurant and enjoy a comfortable dinner of fresh or smoked fish with garlic and his pudding, washed down with his favorite Egyptian barley beer, up to the millionaire banker who owned a palace in the city and a villa by the canal that connected Alexandria with Canubis. What a jostling crowd of all nations in these streets, in the market, where, according to the joke of a contemporary, anything might be got except snow. You get anything in Alexandria except snow. That's right. Or by the savants of Alexandria, or by the harbors, what cool shades, delicious retreats, vast halls, magnificent libraries, where the savants of Alexandria assembled and taught every conceivable branch of learning, and its far-famed physicians prescribed for the poor, consummative patients set thither from all parts of Italy. What bustle and noise among that ever-excitable, chatty, conceited, vain, pleasure-loving multitude, whose highest enjoyment was the theater and singers. Does that sound familiar? The highest enjoyment of these people is theater and singers. Okay. What scenes on that long canal to Canubis, lined with luxurious inns, where barks full of pleasure-seekers reveled in the cool shade of the banks, or sped to Canubis, that scene of all dissipation and luxury proverbial even in those days, and yet close by on the shores of Lake Maraturis, as if by a grim contrast, were the chosen retreats of that sternly ascetic Jewish party, the Therapeutae, whose views and practices in so many points were kindred to those of the Essenes of Palestine. So even though you've got this giant, vibrant city, there was a Jewish enclave of the Therapeutae who didn't have anything to do with anybody that was there, and they kept a very kosher lifestyle in the sense of keeping themselves separate from the people that were there. This sketch of Alexandria will help us to understand. I guess I should put my microphone on. The sketch of Alexandria will help us to understand the surroundings of a large mass of Jews settled in the Egyptian capital. Altogether more than an eighth of the population of the country, 7,800,000 was Jewish. Whether or not a Jewish colony had gone into Egypt at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, or even earlier, the great mass of its residents had been attracted by Alexander the Great, who had granted the Jews equally exceptional privileges with the Macedonians. The later troubles of Palestine under the Syrian kings greatly swelled their numbers, and more so than that of the Ptolemies, with one exception, had favored them. So as we say in there is that when Alexander the Great, when he came to the gates of Jerusalem, the city elders came out and said, "We surrender to you because the prophet Daniel proclaimed that you would rule, and that we're not going to fight you because that would be fighting against God's will." And he said, "All right, well, I accept your surrender, and as tribute to me, you must name every male child in the city Alexander." That's why today you can still meet Jewish boys who are named Alexander, because Alexander the Great said, "You're going to name your sons Alexander in my honor." Because of this strange event where they actually came out and said, our God has prophesied that you will be the ruler. That's probably why they got equal standing with Macedonians in terms of rights and privileges. And then it says here that when Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus's family, the Seleucids, took over Israel, things got real hard in Israel. And a lot of Jews left. In fact, Jason Oniad, who is the high priest at that time at the temple, failed to pay a bribe to Antiochus in time, and another man took the high priestly role, even though he was not of the line of Aaron. Another man became high priest who was a Levite, and at that point Jason Oniad said, we're leaving. And he took the priesthood with him and left and went to Egypt, and they established a new temple in Egypt in the city of Leontopolis, which is right down the road from the Great Pyramids. And it was found in the early 1900s. The Arabs called it the Mound of the Jews, and they had an Arabic phrase that literally translated the Mound of the Jews. And it was in that actual mound that archaeologists found the Temple of Leontopolis, which had been started by Jason Oniad, which serviced the people of Alexandria. That is where people in Alexandria would go to make their sacrifices, because that's where the Aaronic high priest actually was. The Sadducees ruled in Israel, and even though the Pharisees had convinced one of the Greek queens to make it law-abiding, like it was legally binding that you had to pay the half-shekel temple tax, they called it, or you could be prosecuted at law, and that was one of the Greek queens. I think it was one of the Cleopatras actually that they got to do that, but it was like Cleopatra II or something. It was, in like 70 BC, somewhere around there. It's actually in Alfred Edersheim's The Temple and Its Ministries. He talks about how the Pharisees got that the temple tax established. That's the temple tax that when they came to Peter and says, does your master pay the temple tax? And Peter's like, yes, of course we pay the temple tax. And then he went to Yeshua and he says, we need to pay the temple tax. And Yeshua's like, well, does the king ask his sons to pay taxes, or does he ask people that aren't his sons to pay taxes? And Peter's like, well, he asked the people that aren't his sons to pay taxes. And Yeshua said, that's right. But so that we don't cause any trouble, fish up a fish from out, the water, and you will find the 2 drachma in his mouth to pay that temple tax. So, yes, even though it was inappropriate that he be taxed, he still did pay that temple tax. Let's see here. Who granted the Jews equal and exceptional privileges with the Macedonians. The latter troubles of Palestine under the Syrian kings greatly swelled their numbers, and the Syrian kings, and the more so the Ptolemies, that's the royal family in Egypt. That was the Greek royal family. That's the family line that Cleopatra came from. They were pretty nice to the Jews. There was only one Ptolemy that was known for persecuting Jews, with one exception, had favored them. Originally, a special quarter had been assigned to the Jews in the city, the Delta, by the eastern harbor and the Canobus Canal, probably alike to keep the community separate from its convenience for commercial purposes. So he's saying it's probably not so much to keep them separate from other people, but because that's where the commercial district was, and a lot of them were businessmen. Originally, let's see, the privileges which the Ptolemies had accorded to the Jews were confirmed and even enlarged by Julius Caesar. The export trade in grain was now in their hands, and the harbor and the river police committed to their charge. 2 quarters in the city are named as specially Jewish, not, however, in the sense of their being that they were confined to them. Their synagogues, surrounded by shady trees, stood in all parts of the city, but the chief glory of the Jewish community in Egypt, of which even the Palestinians boasted, was the great central synagogue, built in the shape of a basilica with double colonnade, and so large that it needed a signal for those most distant to know the proper moment for their responses. The different trade guilds sat there together, so that a stranger would at once know where to find the Jewish employers and or follow the workmen. And this is from the Talmud, 51b. In the choir of this Jewish cathedral stood 70 chairs of state, encrusted with precious stones for the 70 elders who constituted the eldership of Alexandria, on the model of the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. So this was a seriously powerful Jewish city in the midst of Egypt. This place was where Julius Caesar had actually allowed and confirmed the Jews to handle the payment of grain from Egypt into the Roman Empire, where they literally provided enough grain to feed the capital city of Rome for 4 months. You got to remember, they had the panem, is what they called it, and that's the bread in the circuses. So they would feed people bread at the Colosseum. If you came to the Colosseum to watch a show, you would also get free food while you were there from the state. It is a strange, almost inexplicable fact that the Egyptian Jews had actually built a schismatic temple. And here we're going to hear about it. During the terrible Syrian persecutions in Palestine, Onias, the son of the murdered high priest Onias III, had sought safety in Egypt. Ptolemy Philometor not only received him kindly, but gave a disused heathen temple in the town of Leontopolis for a Jewish sanctuary. Here a new Aaronic priesthood ministered, their support being derived from the revenues of the district around. The new temple, however, resembled not the one of Jerusalem, either in outward appearance nor in its internal fittings. At first, the Egyptian Jews were very proud of their new sanctuary and professed to see it in a fulfillment of the prediction of Isaiah 19:19, that 5 cities in the land of Egypt should speak the language of Canaan, of which one was to be called Ir HaHeres, which the Septuagint, in their original form, or by some later emendation, altered into, quote, the city of righteousness, unquote. This temple continued from about 160 BC to shortly after the temple's destruction in Jerusalem. So this functioning temple with an Aaronic priesthood continued the daily ministration till even after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So this is a functioning house of Jehovah in Egypt as prophesied by Isaiah 19:19. This temple, let's see, it could scarcely be called a rival to that on Mount Moriah, since the Egyptian Jews also owned that of Jerusalem as their central sanctuary, to which they made their pilgrimages and bought their contributions. While the priest at Leontopolis, before marrying, also consulted the official archives in Jerusalem to ascertain the purity of the descendant of their intended wives. So he's saying they actually the lineage documents of the birthright of people was kept at the temple in Jerusalem. That, by the way, Herod had that burned. In fact, this could actually be what he's referring to when he talks about kill the children. Because I don't know, it seems strange. The way the Jews tend to rebel against Rome, if Herod started killing their kids, why wouldn't they rebel against Herod? Because they were more than willing to rebel against Rome. But if he actually destroyed their bloodline records, then it wouldn't matter who they were, because there was no proof of who they were, and that would have then robbed them of their inheritance and robbed them of their connection to their history, in a certain sense, killing a whole generation of children. The Palestinians designated it contemptuously as the house of Konai, or Onias, and declared the priesthood of Leontopolis incapable of serving in Jerusalem, although on par with those who were disqualified only by some bodily defect. Offerings brought in Leontopolis were considered null, unless in the case of vows to which the name of this temple had been expressly attached. This qualified condemnation seems, however, strangely mild, except on the supposition that the statements we have quoted only date from the time when both temples had long since passed away. So what he's saying is the only documents that we even have to confirm the look of the people in Alexandria at the Temple of Leontopolis is actually coming from much later in writings like the Talmud and such, where they mention it, not in a good light. Like he says, they're saying that even though this is where the Aaronic priesthood was, they were not fit to serve as priests in the same way that a man born with a club foot was not fit to serve as a priest. Nor were such feelings unreasonable. The Egyptian Jews had spread on all sides, southward into Abysia, and into Ethiopia, and westward too and beyond, the province of Cyrene. On the city of that name they formed one of the 4 classes in which its inhabitants were divided. A Jewish inscription at Berenice, apparently dating from the year 13 BC, shows that the Syrian Jews formed a distinct community under 9 rulers of their own, who no doubt attended to the communal affairs, not always an easy matter, since the Syrian Jews were noted, if not for turbulence, yet for strong anti-Roman feelings, which more than once was cruelly quenched in blood. Other inscriptions prove that in other places of their dispersion also the Jews had their own archontes, or rulers, while the special direction of public worship was always entrusted to the arch-synagosos, or the chief ruler of the synagogue, both titles occurring side by side. It is, to say the least, very doubtful whether the high priest at Leonotopolis was ever regarded as, in any real sense, the head of the Jewish community in Egypt. In Alexandria, the Jews were under the rule of Jewish ethnarchs, whose authority was similar to that of the archon of independent cities. But this authority was transferred by Augustus to the whole eldership. Another, probably Roman office, though for obvious reasons often filled by Jews, was that of the Alekbarch, or rather the Arabarch, or Arab Arch, the Arch-Arab, who was set over the Arab population. Among others, Alexander, the brother of Philo, held this post. If we may judge of the position of the wealthy Jewish families in Alexandria by that of this Arabarch, their influence must have been very great. The firm of Alexander was probably as rich as the great Jewish banking and shipping houses of Saramala in Antioch. Its chief was entrusted with the management of the affairs of Antonia, the much-respected sister-in-law of Emperor Tiberius. It was a small thing for such a man to lend King Agrippa, who, when his fortunes were very low, a sum of about £7,000 in 1880, with which to resort to Italy, and this is from the Antiquities 1863, since he advanced it on the guarantee of Agrippa's wife, whom he highly esteemed, and at the same time made provision that the money should not be all spent before the prince met the emperor. Besides, he had his own plans in the matter. 2 of his sons married daughters of King Agrippa, while a third, at the price of apostasy, rose successfully to the post of procurator of Palestine, and finally of governor of Egypt. This is from the Antiquities of Josephus. The temple at Jerusalem bore evidence of wealth and magnificence of this Jewish millionaire. Then the gold and silver with which the 9 massive gates were covered, which led into the temple, were the gift of the great Alexandrian banker. The possession of such wealth, coupled no doubt with pride and self-assertion, and openly spoken contempt of the superstitions around, would naturally excite the hatred of the Alexandrian populace against the Jews. The greater number of those silly stories about the origin, the early history, and the religion of the Jews, which even the philosophers and the ancient historians of Rome record as genuine, originated in Egypt. A whole series of writers, beginning with Manetho, probably around 200 BC, made it their business to give a kind of historical travesty of the events recorded in the book of Moses. The boldest of these scribblers was Apion, to whom Josephus replied, a world-famed charlatan and a liar, who wrote or lectured with equal presumption and falseness on every conceivable subject. So, in a certain sense, they had the Holocaust deniers then too. It was just the people who said basically, well, the Jews are just a bunch of people who came out of Egypt, and they believe in an Egyptian god. That's why we call them the Jews, because the Jew is the god that lives between the mountains. That's actually the name of an Egyptian god, Djew, D-J-E-U. And you can look that one up. But he's the god between the mountains, or between the hills. Or maybe it means in the valley. But they're saying basically at this time that there were these different historians and stuff who were basically trying to do all they could to shame and harm the Jews, saying that they had, that their books were lies, and they were just the same kind of stuff you hear nowadays. Again, even though we're reading about what was going on 2,000 years ago, there's nothing new under the sun. This is the same thing that people are saying today. All right, in Rome, he soon found his level, and the Emperor Tiberius well characterized the irrepressive, boastful talker as the tinkling symbol of the world. So literally, Emperor Tiberius is like, this guy spends a lot of time lying. He had studied, seen, and heard everything, even on 3 occasions, the mysterious sound on the Cosine or the mysterious sound on the Colossus of Memnon as the sun rose upon it. At least, so he graved upon the Colossus itself for the information of all generations. Such was the man on whom the Alexandrians conferred on freedom of their city, to whom they entrusted their most important affairs, and whom they extolled as the victorious, the laborious, the new Homer. There can be little doubt that the popular favor was partly due to Appion's virulent attacks upon the Jews. His grotesque accounts of their history and the religion held them up to contempt. But his real object was to rouse the fanaticism of the populace against the Jews. Every year, so he told them, it was the practice of the Jews to get a hold of some unfortunate Greek, or Hellenean is what it says here, but a Greek person, whom ill chance might bring into their hands, to fatten him for a year, and then to sacrifice him, partaking of his entrails and burying the body, while during these horrible rites they took a fearful oath of perpetual enmity to the Greeks. They were the people who battened on the wealth of Alexandria, who had usurped the quarters of the city to which they had no right, and claimed exceptional privileges, the people who had proved traitors to, and to the ruin of everyone who had trusted them. If the Jews, that's a quote, he exclaimed, quote, are citizens of Alexandria, why do they not worship the same gods as the Alexandrians, unquote? And if they wish to enjoy the protection of the Caesars, why did they not erect statues and pay divine honor to them? There is nothing strange in these appeals to fanaticism of mankind. In one form or another, they have only too often been repeated in all lands and ages, and alas, by the representatives of all creeds. Well might the Jews, as Philo mourns, wish no better for themselves than to simply be treated like other men. This book is written in the 1880s, talking about something happening 2,000 years ago. And it's the same thing that people are doing today. I can get on Facebook, I can get on YouTube right now, and I can find hundreds of Holocaust deniers. I can find hundreds of people tell you there's a Jewish cabal to run the world. I can find you hundreds of people, possibly thousands, who'll talk about the Jew bankers and the fake Jews and white Jews and they're fake and we get rid of them. And then you're like, well, what about the Sephardic Jews? They got kinky hair and big noses and dark hair, dark skin. Should we get rid of them too? Oh, and then, well, what about the Jews that came from the Middle East? What do we do with them? What about the Yemenite Jews? What about the Ethiopian Jews? What are we supposed to just get rid of them all? No. This is the same nonsense that people are trying to spread today. Again, he's talking about something that was happening when Christ was walking the earth. This was happening in a city that was known for having a gigantic Jewish population. And there was a man, let's say a modern day Hitler at that time, who did everything he could to get them out of that city and to bring down the reputation as hard as they could. We have already seen that the ideas entertained in Rome about the Jews were chiefly derived from Alexandrian sources, but it is not easy to understand how a Tacitus, a Cicero, or a Pliny could have credited such absurdities as that the Jews had come from Crete, that is Munda Ida, Mount Ida, on Crete, the island of Crete, or Idaea, which they decided meant, oh, that must be the Mount of the Jews, the Jewish mountain, right? And been expelled on account of leprosy from Egypt. So this is one of the histories. They said, well, the Jews are people that lived on Crete that had got expelled from Egypt and immigrated under an apostate priest named Moses, or that the Sabbath rest originated in sores which had obliged the wanderers to stop short on the seventh day, or that the Jews worshipped the head of an ass, or else Bacchus, that their abstinence from swine's flesh was due to the remembrance of the fear of leprosy, or to the worship of that animal, and their pluralities of the like kind. The educated Roman regarded the Jew with a mixture of contempt and anger, all the more keen that, according to his notions, the Jew had since his subjection to Rome, no longer a right to his religion, and all the more bitter that, do what he might, that despised race confronted him everywhere with a religion so uncompromising as to form a wall of separation, with rites so exclusive as to make them not only strangers but enemies. Such a phenomenon was nowhere else to be encountered. So he's saying that the thing, and again, nothing new under the sun. This is this. You watch the Erwig Jude. That's the Nazi propaganda film they put out to basically say everyone needs to hate Jews. They took snippets from the Talmud. They put them in there without any kind of backing, without any kind of understanding of what these guys are talking about. And they used it to fuel a fire of hatred. Because, yes, if you're going to be in the royal priesthood of God, there is a tendency to separate yourself, which that's what Kodesh means. It means to be separate. Unfortunately, that can grow into racism, and that can grow into classism, and that can grow into ethnism, and that can grow into teachings like the Nefesh Yehudi, which says that the Jew has a soul that you don't. And since the Jew has a soul that you don't, his soul, when he dies, goes back to God. Your soul goes and waits in the ground. His soul gets to return to God. And then, oddly enough, if you're a believer in the Chabad, which is a more ultra-Orthodox, modern Jewish Phariseeism, then that soul can actually be reincarnated up to 3 times as a woman, so that it can fulfill all the mitzvah concerning a woman, as a man, so it can fulfill all the mitzvah concerning being a man, and as a priest, so it can fulfill all the mitzvah concerning being a priest, and thereby fulfill all 613 commandments. I'm sorry, 620 commandments, because 7 commandments were given by men, the 620th of which is the observance of Hanukkah, for you Hanukkah observant folks out there. Remember, that is a commandment of the rabbis. It's the 620th law of the Torah, is that you must keep Hanukkah. All right. So needless to say, these, fake histories, strange relationships of words, like, for instance, people are like, don't say Yod He Vav He as Jehovah, because the word Hova means chaos and destruction. I say, well, I guess I should never say the word chat again, because it's got hat in it, and I'm wearing a hat, and I don't want you to think I'm wearing a hat when I say let's have a chat. You might think I'm saying you need to put on my hat. No, that's not how words work. When you add letters to them, it changes the meaning of them. It's not a strictly pictorial language, which apparently is what some people think that Hebrew is. And I'm not saying that there aren't, a pictorial basis. Paleo-Hebrew looks like pictures to me. But apparently it's got a lot of finesse. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I couldn't tell you if it's a phonetic alphabet purely, or if it really did start as a hieroglyphic type of picture language. I don't know. But I know it's not a good reason to disparage what people who actually have spent 2,000 years speaking it and living in it, or should I say 3,500 years since Moses, speaking it, living in it, and being told the name of God in it. Anyways, all right. So what they're saying is, the Roman man who's like, look, why can't you just worship our gods? Why can't you just be cool with us? And this is exactly what Catholicism is, by the way. The word Catholicism, it means universal. Catholicism is supposed to be the universal religion. So you can go anywhere on the world and meet any people anywhere, and they should have no problem working with Catholicism, because it is a universal religion. It'll take anybody and it'll work them in. That's the idea. Unfortunately, because of what the Torah states, there's specific rules, specific laws, specific ways you have to live. If you violate them, then you are sinning. And if you are sinning, then you're not doing what God wants. And if you want to be God's people, you need to do what God wants. So it can cause trouble, even with modern day Christianity, who can perceive the way that Jews treat them as being, racism or classism, or, like I said, ethnism, whatever you want to call it. This same wall of division that the Romans were complaining about the Jews at the time is still around today. People are still saying the same kind of things. Again, nothing new under the sun. The Romans were intensely practical in their view. Political life and religion were not only intertwined, but the one was a part of the other. A religion apart from the political organization, or that which offered not, as a quid pro quo, some direct return from the deity to his votaries, they thought that was utterly inconceivable. Every country has its own religion, argued Cicero in his appeal to Flaccus. So long as Jerusalem was unvanquished, Judaism might claim toleration, but had not the immortal God shown that they thought of it when the Jewish race was conquered? This was a kind of logic that appealed to the humblest in the crowd, which thronged to hear the great orator defending his client, among others, against the charge of preventing the transport from Asia to Jerusalem of the annual temple tribute. So this guy was trying to stop that money moving from moving to Jerusalem. These giant amounts of, and there was giant amounts of money moving. When they paid that half shekel tax, you got millions of people paying half a shekel. That's a lot of money. That's a 1 million. That's 500,000 shekels. Marching its way over or sailing its way over to Jerusalem. This was not a popular accusation to bring against a man in such an assembly. And as the Jews who to create a disturbance had, we are told, distributed themselves among the audience of such numbers that Cicero somewhat rhetorically declared he would fain have spoken with bated breath so as to be only audible to the judges. Listen to the great orator. They must have felt a keen pang shoot to their hearts while he held them up to scorn of the heathen, and touched with rough finger their open sore as he urged the ruin of their nation as the one unanswerable argument which materialism could bring against the religion of the unseen. Oh, here we go again. There's the Jewish problem. 2,000 years ago, Cicero, a Roman, wants the Jews out of Alexandria. They got too much power. They got too much money. They got too much. They got. He is a man of covetousness. That's why he despises them, because God is good to people who do what he says. It's as simple as that. And when someone who does not do what God says sees you getting something and they ain't getting it, they want to take it from you because they have thievery and covetousness in their hearts. They say, you're not like us, you need to go. It doesn't matter who. We have conquered your people. Why do you not worship our gods? We have vanquished you and your God. It's not what God said. Jehovah said he's the one that kicked us out. Jehovah said he's the one that brought you in to do it. Jehovah said he'd feed us to you for what we did. And that one day he will return us to our land, which has happened. And this has already happened. So needless to say, again, nothing new under the sun. This is the same old story. The same old attack on the Jews. The same old wish for their destruction. The same old desire to take everything that they have. And that religion, was it not, in the words of Cicero, quote, a barbarous superstition, unquote, and were it not its inheritance, as Pliny had it in the histories of the nation, quote, a race distinguished from its contempt of the gods, unquote, to begin with their theology. In other words, it's contemptible. These people find our gods distasteful. When we have vanquished them, we are their conquerors. Obviously, ours are better. The Roman philosopher would Race distinguished. The Roman philosopher would sympathize with this disbelief of all spiritual realities, as, on the other hand, he could understand the popular modes of worship and superstition. But what was to be said for a worship of something quite unseen, an adoration, as it seemed to him, of the clouds and of the sky, without any visible symbol, conjoined with outer rejection of every form of religion, whether it was Asiatic or Egyptian or Greek or Roman, and the refusal even to pay the customary divine honor to the Caesars as the incarnations of Roman power? It's like, I don't understand why these Jews have to be so different than everyone else in the rest of the world, and why, at minimum, they don't acknowledge that the Caesar of Rome is a god on the earth. Same old thing. All right, let's see here. Not to mention that it would be violating both the first and second commandment to do any of these things that this man has brought up. Next, as to their rites, foremost among them was an initiatory rite of circumcision, a constant subject for coarse jests. What could be the meaning of it? or of what seemed like some ancestral veneration for the pig, or the dread of it, since they made it a religious duty not to partake of its flesh. Their Sabbath observance, however it had originated, was merely an indulgence in idleness. The fast young Roman literati would find this amusement in wandering on Sabbath eve through the tangled, narrowed streets of the ghetto, watching how the dim lamp within shed its unsavory light, while the inmates stumbled prayers with balanced lips. And this is from Persius. He's quoting some ancient work. Or they would, like Ovid, seek in the synagogue occasion for their dissolute amusements. The Thursday fast was another target for their wit. In short, at best, the Jew was a constant theme for popular merriment, and the theater would resound with laughter as his religion was lampooned, no matter how absurd the stories or how poor the punning. So it's like Romans had no problem, and the Greeks, no problem making fun of Jews. They were the butt of every joke, because it's easy to make fun of them because they are so lazy, and they're so fat, and they're so rich, and they control the money, and they control the banks, and they control the grain coming out of Egypt, and we just need to just laugh it up because they are just the worst people. Well, you don't see this today. You don't see the Jews lampooned on television, at least not in the United States. Now, you might see them lampooned in shows in the Middle East, but they're not lampooned here. But at least at this time in the ancient world, they were the butt of every joke because they were an easy target. Even when they had power, even when they had prestige, even when they had money and gold, silver, still the butt of every joke and nothing they can do about it. Okay? All right. And then, as the proud Roman passed on the Sabbath through the streets, Judaism would obtrude itself upon his notice by the shops that were shut, and by the strange figures that idly moved about in holiday attire. They were strangers in a strange land, not only without sympathy with what passed around, but with marked contempt and abhorrence of it, while there was that about their whole bearing which expressed the unspoken feeling that the time of Rome's fall and their own supremacy was at hand. To put the general feeling in the words of Tacitus, the Jews kept close together, and were ever most liberal to one another, but they were filled with bitter hatred of all others. They would neither eat nor sleep with strangers, and the first thing which they taught their proselytes was to despise the gods, to renounce their own country, and to rend the bonds which they had made with parents and children and kindred. To be sure, there was some ground of distorted truth in these charges, for the Jew as such was only intended for Palestine, but a necessity not of his own making. He was now, so to speak, the negative element in the heathen world, yet one which, do what he might, would always obtrude itself upon public notice. But the Roman satirists went further. They accused the Jews of such hatred of all other religionists that they would not even show the way to any who worshipped otherwise, nor point out the cooling spring to the thirsty. According to Tacitus, there was a political and religious reason for this. In order to keep the Jews separate from all other nations, Moses had given them rights, contrary to those of any other race, that they might regard as holy that what was sacred to regard as unholy what was sacred to others, and as lawful what they held in abomination. Such a people deserved neither consideration nor pity. And when the historian tells how thousands of their number had been banished by Tiberius to Sardinia, he dismisses the probability of their perishing in this severe climate with the cynical remark that it entailed a, quote, poor loss. So he's talk about anti-Semitism. Again, there's nothing new under the sun. This is the same thing as has been many times. And it's okay, because when you read in the scriptures, you understand why this is happening. Unfortunately, God's people can never be too entrenched in any place for too long, because our home is in Israel, or as he says here, Palestine. The home is in Israel. The inheritance is from the river Euphrates to the brook called the Nile. That's the inheritance. That's where God's people are going to end up. According to Isaiah 66, whether you like it or not, the people in the nation that you are in are going to take you and drag you there, bring you in a vessel, a clean vessel, as you should bring your offerings to Jehovah. They will bring you in a clean vessel. Let me tell you. He says, I will send fishermen. I'll send fishers after you first. What was Peter? What was Simon Kiva? What was Kiva? He was a fisherman. The fishermen have been said. He said, then I will send hunters after you. And guess what the Nazis are famous for being? Jew hunters. And don't get it twisted. From 1933 to 1938, the Havara Agreement existed between Zionists and Adolf Hitler. And that agreement allowed that Jews who wanted to leave German-controlled lands could go to Palestine. It cost them 1,500 pounds sterling now. Don't get me wrong, that's a lot of money. But if they could get it together, they would be sent with 1,500 pounds sterling worth of German material to rebuild the land of Israel. That seems a strange deal for a man so known for hating Jews to make. It's a strange deal. All right, here we go. And again, all I'm trying to tell you is there's nothing new under the sun. Nothing new. Still, the Jew was there in the midst of them. It is impossible to fix the date when the first Jewish wanderers found their way to the capital of the world. We know that in the wars under Pompey, Cassius, and Antonius, many were brought captive to Rome and sold as slaves. In general, the Republican Party was hostile. The Caesars were friendly to the Jews. The Jewish slaves in Rome proved an unprofitable and troublesome acquisition. They clung so tenaciously to their ancestral customs that it was impossible to make them conform to the ways of a heathen household. How far they would carry their passive resistance appears from a story told by Josephus in Life, Book 3, about some Jewish priests of his acquaintance who, during their captivity in Rome, refused to eat anything but figs and nuts. Sound familiar? Like Daniel? Sound like Daniel? So as to avoid the defilement of Gentile food. Their Roman masters deemed it prudent to give their Jewish slaves their freedom, either at a small ransom or even without it. These freedmen, or liberty, formed the nucleus of the Jewish community in Rome, and in great measure determined its social character. Of course there were, as always, industrious, sober, pushing. In course of time, many of them acquired wealth. By and by, Jewish immigrants of greater distinction swelled their number. Still, their social position was inferior to that of their co-religionists in other lands. A Jewish population so large as 40,000 in the time of Augustus and 60,000 in that of Tiberius would naturally include all ranks, merchants, bankers, liberati, even actors. In a city which offered such temptations, they would number among those of every degree or religious profession. Nay, some who would not only imitate the habits of those around, but try to undo their gross licentiousness. Yet even so, they would vainly endeavor to efface the hateful mark of being a Jew. So even the ones who did everything they could to look like the people around them, even the ones who did everything they could to assimilate into the Roman culture, everybody still knew they were a Jew. And that carries with it a mark. And you can call it good or you can call it bad, but it is a mark and you're not going to get rid of it. You're not going to wash it off. So consider it a blessing to be regarded as a Jew in these places, because everybody knows you're a set-apart people. Even if you don't want to be, they know you are. Augustus has assigned to many Jews as their special quarter the 14th region across the Tiber, which stretched from the slope of the Vatican onwards and across to the Tiber Island, where the boats from Ostia were wont to unload. This seems to have been their poor quarter, chiefly inhabited by hawkers, sellers of matches, glass, old clothes, and second-hand wares. The Jewish burying ground is in this quarter, and it gives evidence of their condition. The whole appointments and of the graves are mean. There is neither marble nor any trace of painting, unless it be a rough representation of the 7-branched candlestick in red coloring. Another Jewish quarter was by the Porta Capena, where the Appian Way entered the city. close by, the ancient sanctuary of Egeria was utilized at the time of Juvenal as a Jewish hawking place. But there must have been richer Jews also in that neighborhood, since the burying place there discovered has paintings, some even of mythological figures, of which the meaning has not yet been ascertained. A third Jewish burial ground was near the ancient Christian catacombs. But indeed the Jewish residents in Rome must have spread over every quarter of the city, even the best, to judge by the location of their synagogues. From the inscriptions we have made acquainted not only with the existence, but with the names of not fewer than 7 of these synagogues. 3 of them respectively bear the names of Augustus, Agrippa, and Volonius, either as their patrons or because the worshippers were chiefly their attendants and clients, while 2 of them derive their names from the Campus Martius and the Quarter Subura in which they stood. The synagogue Elias may have been so called from bearing on its front the device of an olive tree, a favorite and in the Romans specially significant emblem of Israel, whose fruit crushed beneath a heavy weight would wield the precious oil by which the divine light would shed its brightness across the night of heathendom. Of course, there must have been other synagogues besides those whose names have been discovered. One other mode of tracking the footsteps of Israel's wanderings seems strangely significant. It is by tracing their records among the dead, reading them on broken tombstones and in ruined monuments. They were rude, and the inscriptions, most of them in bad Greek, or still worse Latin, none in Hebrew, are like the stammering of strangers. Yet what a contrast between the simple faith and earnest hope which they express and the grim proclamation of utter disbelief in any future to the soul not unmixed with language of the coarsest materialism on the graves of so many of the polished Romans. Truly, the pen of God in history has, as so often, ratified the sentence which a nation had pronounced upon itself. The civilization was doomed which could inscribe over its dead such words as, quote, to eternal sleep, unquote, to perpetual rest, unquote, and more coarsely express it thus, quote, I was not, and I became, I was, and I am no more. Thus much is true. Who says other lies? For I shall not be, adding as it were, by way of mortal. And thou who livest, drink, play, come. Not so did God teach his people. As we pick our way among these broken stones, we can understand how a religion which proclaimed a hope so different must have spoken to the hearts of many even at Rome, and much more how this blessed assurance of life and immortality, which Christianity afterwards brought, could win its thousands, though it were at the cost of poverty, shame, torture in the arena. Wandering from graveyard to graveyard and deciphering the records of the dead, we can almost read the history of Israel in the days of the Caesars, or when Paul the prisoner set foot in the soil of Italy, when St. Paul on the journey of the, quote, Castor and Pollux, unquote, touched at Syracuse, he would during his stay of 3 days find himself in the midst of a Jewish community, as we learn from an inscription. When he disembarked in Puteoli, he was in the oldest Jewish settlement next to that of Rome, where the loving hospitality of Christian Israelites constrained him to tarry over a Sabbath. As he went towards Rome and reached Capua, he would meet Jews there, as we infer from the tombstone of one Alpheus Huda, who had been archon of the Jews and the arch synagogos in Capua. As he entered the city, he found in Anxur a synagogue. In Rome itself, the Jewish community was organized as in other places. Acts 28:17. It sounds strange as, after these many centuries, we again read the names of the archons of their various synagogues, all the Romans, such as Claudius, Astratus, Julian, who were archons alike of the Campasian and Agrippian synagogue priest, the son of Julian, the Archian synagogos, or the chief of the eldership of the Augustinian synagogue, and so in other places. On these tombstones we find names of Jewish synagogue dignitaries in every center of the population, in Pompeii, in Venetia, in the birthplace of Horus, in Jewish catacombs and in similar Jewish inscriptions in Africa, in Asia, in the islands of the Mediterranean, in Aegea, in Patraa, in Athens, even where as yet records of these early settlements have not been discovered, we still infer their presence, as we remember the most incredible extent of Roman commerce, which led to such large settlements in Britain, or as we discover among the tombstones those of the Syrian merchants, as in Spain, where St. Paul hoped to preach, no doubt also to his own countrymen, throughout Gaul, and even in the remotest parts of Germany. Thus the statements of Josephus and Philo as the dispersion of Israel throughout all lands of the known world are fully borne out. So just like Jehovah said he would do, he spread them everywhere. They are everywhere among every people, proclaiming his name. If they're doing the job, proclaiming his name and letting it be known that they are his people. And even the ones who tried to keep their mouths shut about it, even the ones who tried to hide it, couldn't hide it because the mark was on them. People knew they were Jews when they met them. In truth, there was no law to prevent the spread of Judaism, excepting the brief period when Tiberius in 19 AD banished the Jews from Rome and sent 4,000 of their number to fight the Banditi in Sardinia. The Jews enjoyed not only perfect liberty, but exceptional privileges. In the reign of Caesar and of Augustus, we might have quite a series of edicts which secured the full exercise of their religion and their communal rights. A lot of people don't know this, but Augustus, when he was down, he said he wanted to be remembered as a man who could be thought of as a god. That was something he was shooting for, and he was known for being an extremely virtuous man. Like, he didn't do nothing wrong in a religious sense. In the eyes of the Romans, he did not do things wrong. I mean, he honored their gods, and he was an upstanding man. And he was known for being a good man. So it says here, even among Augustus, we find a series of edicts which secured the full exercise of their religion and communal rights. In virtue of these, there were not to be disturbed in their religious ceremonies, nor in the observance of their Sabbaths and the feasts. The annual temple tribute was allowed to be transported to Jerusalem, and the alienation of these funds by the civil magistrates was treated as sacrilege. So they weren't able to tax it. All these road taxes and all these guys sitting at bridges collecting money from people going by, they couldn't take a piece of it. They couldn't get a cut of that money coming into Jerusalem. Augustus Caesar forbade it. It was a sacrilege. As the Jews objected to bear arms or march on the Sabbath, they were freed from military service. On similar grounds, they were not obliged to appear in courts of law on their holy days. Augustus even ordered that when the public distribution of corn or of money among the citizens fell on a Sabbath, the Jews were to receive their share on the following day. In a similar spirit, the Roman authorities confirmed a decree by which the founder of Antioch, Seleucus I, also called Nicator, had granted the Jews the right of citizenship in all of the cities of Asia Minor and Syria which he had built, and the privilege of receiving instead of the oil that was distributed, which their religion forbade them to use, an equivalent amount of money. And this is from Josephus' Antiquities. Their rights were maintained by Vespasian and Titus even after the last Jewish war, notwithstanding the earnest remonstrances of these cities. No wonder that at the death of Caesar in 44 BC, the Jews of Rome gathered for many nights, waking strange feelings of awe in the city as they chanted in mournful melodies their psalms around the pyre. On the pyre on which their dead benefactor had been burnt, and raised their pathetic dirges. They mean pathetic in the sense of it being emotional. Pathos, that kind of pathetic. The measures of Tiberius against them were due to the influence of his favorite Sejanus, and ceased with his sway. Besides, there were the outcomes of public feelings at the time against all foreign rights, which had been roused by the vile conduct of the priests of Isis towards the Roman matron, and again provoked by the gross imposture upon Feluva.
a noble Roman proselyte, on the part of some vagabond rabbis. But even so, there was no reason to believe that literally all Jews had left Rome. Many would find remains to remain secretly behind. At any rate, 20 years afterward, Philo found a large community there, ready to support him on his mission on behalf of his Egyptian countrymen. Any temporary measures against the Jews can, therefore, scarcely be regarded as a serious interference in their privileges or a cessation of the imperial favor showed upon them. So even at a time of persecution, God was still blessing them and favoring them. He was even allowing them, they could even go and live in the land. I mean, he was favoring them all around the world, wherever they were. Even to the point that the Romans couldn't even understand why they came out to mourn for Julius Caesar after he died. Because he had been good to them. He had protected them. He had given them privilege. And Augustus Caesar continued that run. Remember, that was Octavius. That was his adopted nephew. And for all the bad news you hear about Romans, here we got the first two emperors of Rome keeping the Jews safe. Even Tiberius, who attacked the city, destroyed the temple, still allowed them to have privileges, but he did put an end to that whole temple. He put an end to that. There wasn't going to be no more fights coming out of Jerusalem. So next time we'll read from chapter 6. That'll be the political and religious life of the Jewish dispersion in the West, their union and the great hope of the coming deliverer. So we're going to talk about, now we're starting to get into that. We're going to start getting heavy into the anticipation of Messiah. And of course, there's many, even today, different Jewish ideas about what Messiah is. You know, they'll say, well, Isaiah says he's supposed to be this, and Zechariah says he's supposed to do this. Until you end up with kind of a division that's kind of accepted by modern Jews, which is the idea of Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David, where Messiah ben Joseph is what Isaiah had described as the suffering servant, the one who'd be, beaten and scarred for our iniquities and, stabbed, but no bones broken, which is, we would say, well, that's Yeshua. I mean, doesn't that sound like Yeshua? Sounds like it. But then there's Messiah ben David, who's the conquering king who's coming to rule with a rod of iron. And that apparently has not happened yet, because as well favored as the Jews may have been and are being still today by different nations, there's still not that Davidic king sitting there ruling from the throne. Even though, honestly, Queen Ing will probably tell you she's a bloodline heir of Abraham. Probably tell you she's right from David line. Probably tell you she's from Muhammad line too. Cover all the bases at once, right? Good thing about being royalty, you have a very long bloodline registered in your books, kept by your people. And maybe they're true and maybe they're not. Nobody knows, except whoever's the one that made them. That being said, I don't worry. I'm not worried about any of that stuff. I myself fully believe Yeshua is the Messiah. And when I say Messiah, I don't mean conquering. I don't mean guy that came to conquer the Romans. I mean the guy who came to conquer me. He conquered me. Okay. And I'm a tough cookie. I might have a nice smile, but I'm not necessarily a nice guy. And believe me, I'm hard to convince. So you better be real good at convincing. And he got me. He got me. He got me a long time ago. And it didn't take much convincing, really. He just kicked that door right open and set up shop. Because like he said, when his lambs hear his voice, they come to him. I didn't have much choice. I heard his voice, I came. That's about the way it works. And maybe one day he will return as that conquering king, and maybe in my lifetime I'll get to see this, the Messiah ben David, and maybe Israel get to see that, and they'll finally feel like he's lived up to what they expected. When he came among the Pharisees, they said, well, come and tell us all the secrets of the Torah. And then, of course, he went and corrected them on the halakha. And then he gave them his own Haggadah, which I guess you say, in a certain sense, he was establishing halakha, which is the walk. They were like, why don't you and your disciples wash your hands? The elders say we're supposed to wash our hands. Why aren't you washing your hands? That's what we do. That's part of being Jew. That's what Jews do. And he's like, that's not in the Torah. Washing your hands not going to keep you from doing what's wrong. washing your hand ain't going to keep your mouth from saying the things that are going to, corrupt your life. It's like people are like, "Oh, I'm doing my best here. I ain't committed no adultery." And he's like, "Have you ever looked at a woman with lust in your heart?" Well, yeah, but I ain't never touched her. Then you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. And considering we're talking about what happens between you and Yehovah, he knows what you do. He knows what you think. You've already committed it. He brought... People will say there's 613 laws in the Old Testament. There's no way you could keep them all. Well, I mean, yeah, well, obviously, because they don't all apply to men, and they don't all apply to women, and some only apply to the priesthood. But if you go by what's in the New Testament, there's about 1,500 laws in there. If you go by every imperative statement, and we say imperative, that's a command. Every statement that's said in the Greek form of a command, there's about 1,500 of those. So a lot of them, of course, are just reiterations of what's in the Old Testament. If you really took the time to read the Torah, if you really took the time to study the Ten Commandments, you really took the time to understand in your heart what is being taught to you. When you read the New Testament, you're like, well, that makes perfect sense. Like I'll give you, for instance, from today. Today I was talking to a fella. He's like, I said, there's no other gods but the one God. There's just Yehovah. That's it. There's no other gods. And then he said, you're telling me Satan's not God of the world? And he's, because he quoted that famous from 2 Corinthians 4:4, right? Because if the God of this world had not blinded their eyes, and immediately I said to him, that is not Satan. The God of the world is Yehovah. He's the one that blinded their eyes. You can read that in Isaiah. You could just read what Yeshua said. He said that their eyes were blinded and their hearts were hard, because if they could hear with their ears, they would turn and they would repent, and they would follow him. But that's not what they're going to do, because that's not the plan from Yehovah expressed by Isaiah. It's just not going to happen. And somehow that got turned into being that Satan is the God of the earth. Because somebody wrote in the King James with a little g when they wrote God, but that word's theos. It's the same word it is when it talks about God everywhere else. Why is it suddenly the devil? I didn't get it. And I was like, maybe I'm going to read this part about the prince of the power of the air now. And then I'm reading through that, and I'm like, you know what? I don't think that's talking about the devil either. I think the prince of the power of the air is talking about the rulers of Israel who are teaching the halakha, which causes them to be unable to accept the teachings of Yeshua because they are unwilling. Like they're not going. And this is a problem modern Jews have. They look at Christianity and they say, that is not what we're about. That we're not compatible. I'm going to look in your Bible and I can see it ain't the same Bible we got. So I'm sorry, we can't do what you do. But it's because they've been taught that by a Christianity that separated itself from the Torah, a Christianity that separated itself from the teachings that God had given his people. And you can't do that. You can't throw away the stone that the builder had given you. And when I say stone, the tables of stone, right? The 10 Commandments came on 2 tables of stone. That's what they were delivered to the people on. If you throw those tables of stone away and you try to build some new understanding, then you're building your house on shifting sand, and when the storm comes, it's going to fall down. That's exactly what Yeshua told you. And just watch out. Be wary, be careful. Don't believe everything you've heard. Like I said, people say, well, Satan's a prince of the earth. It says so in the Bible. Take a look. Read that Bible. Is that what it says? Read it carefully. Read it closely. Remember that these are people who learned the Torah, taught the Torah. Paul was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was raised at Gamaliel's feet. He either learned from Gamaliel, the grandson of Hillel, or he learned from Hillel along with Gamaliel, Hillel's grandson. It should be no surprise to people that when Gamaliel gets something that Paul's involved with, brought up to him, and he's like, you know what, just leave these guys alone. If God's in what they do, then it'll prosper. If he's not, then it'll fail. And quit worrying about it. Just don't bother with it. Because you can imagine Gamaliel, because he knows Saul of Tarsus, right? He knows Saul. He's like, this guy's like a top end student. He's one of the big names. And I know he's a Pharisee. I know he keeps the law, and I know he knows everything about being a Pharisee. I guess I'll just let him keep doing what he's going to do, and we'll see what happens, right? That's, it's simple wisdom. I mean, he trusted Paul. That's what it boiled down to. He just knew that, I guess more than anything else, he trusted Yehovah, because he's like, well, if it's going to work, it'll work. If it won't, it won't. And what are we going to do to stop it? What are we going to do? Kick against the pricks, as Paul would say? We're going to fight God? He going to win. So there ain't no point in messing with him. Anyway, thank you for reading with me today in chapter 5 of Alfred Edersheim's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. And again, we're still just learning about the world as it was at that time. The Greek world, the world east of Jerusalem, which is called I guess we'd say the Asiatic world, and the conflux of the two right there at Jerusalem. People refer to Jerusalem as the middle of the world. Like literally, it's the middle of the world. Like to the east of Jerusalem, people write right to left. To the west, people write left to right. It's like the middle of the world in some very strange way. So be blessed. Rukabah Yehovah, not Adonai, because that just means Lord. And he said he don't want us to call him Lord no more. We need to call him Ishi, not Bali. We can call him husband. He's our man now. He's the man. He's our man. We don't have to think of him as a slave master. But legally speaking, consider yourself a slave. So be blessed. Thanks again. Bye.